Everyone has moments in life they can't just stop thinking about. They can be embarrassing things, like that one time you face planted in front of a group of teenagers, or something amazing like the first time you hosted your family for the holidays. And on Baby, This is Keke Palmer, hosted by me, Keke Palmer, and presented by BMW, we know to savor the good memories and let go of the bad. And one thing everyone remembers fondly is their first time behind the wheel of a BMW. So come join me and BMW this summer as we explore pop culture moments and topics you just can't stop thinking about on Baby, This is Keke Palmer, sponsored by BMW, the ultimate driving machine.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
What is The Briefing Room? It's a behind-the-scenes look at how the criminal justice system works and the lives of the people within that system.
If you love true crime, well, these are the real people who do the job every day of making sure justice is served.
Hi, I'm Detective Dave.
I'm Detective Dan. Together we have decades of experience in local law enforcement, a profession that we think is often misunderstood.
So we're going to explore how to do it right, and we won't shy away from when it's done wrong. These are stories you'll hear nowhere else. Unique, frank, and unvarnished.
From the team that brought you Small Town Dicks, this is The Briefing Room. Episode 1 drops on August 30th.
We'll meet you in the briefing room.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
In each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is Bryan Christopher. He's a writer, reviewer, and self-proclaimed well-meaning oaf, whose work you've seen at Morgue, Daily Dead, and Cinepunks. Welcome to the show, Bryan.
Good to be here. Yeah, I mean, I can't really think of a better way to describe myself. I think I pretty much nailed it. So, yeah, I'm glad it's sticking.
Well, I do have a question. Are you the evil doppelganger? Or is Taylor Hicks the evil doppelganger?
Oh, man. Like, why'd you have to come out swinging like that? That's not nice. All right. So let me get this out of the way. So I'll put this out there. Never make your social media handle based off of spite, because like it's just going to keep haunting you forever. It basically comes off of like there was a course of, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years where someone who shall remain nameless was very popular because of American Idol. And over the course of that 2 years, I got told I looked like him at least a half dozen times by like separate people. It wasn't like the same, like 2 or 3 people. It was like, had to have been at least like 6 separate times, which, you know, isn't that many. But when you're being told you look like Taylor Hicks, it sticks in your head. And it kind of like, it's scarring, which is fitting for this podcast.
Wait, okay, okay. I looked up Taylor Hicks because I had no idea who he was. He also looks like Paul Hollywood from the Great British Baking Show.
Stop it. No.
So can you be the evil Paul Hollywood too? I'm going to start it. I'm going to start a rumor.
I love that you said this, Mary Beth, because I was going to say it
Joe
too.
Joe Lipset already gave me that kick to the nuts. So that's...
Oh my God. I'm so glad that...
Thanks, Joe.
Well, it was good stopping by. I'm going to head out, everybody.
Briefest interview ever.
You came on the show and we submitted you to cyberbullying as soon as the show started. Welcome to Scarred for Life, where we bully our
Great
guests.
To be here.
You're going to like ride a dragon and chase us because of the cyberbullying?
Oh, yeah. I hope you have your dumpsters picked out because you're done for.
Okay. So let's bring it back to
picked out.
Crappy Club for Jerks is what this is.
Okay, let's bring this back to before anyone ever knew of Taylor Hicks and your your doppelganger looks to him. Let's take you back to the very beginning. How did you get introduced to horror?
My mom. It's pretty much as simple as that. She's always been a fan of horror, and it's kind of one of those things where I couldn't tell you like the first movie I ever saw because it was just always on when I was a kid. So it's just kind of one of those things that's permeated my consciousness ever since I can remember. I can think back to like the earliest memories I have of it, but I can't say it was like this was the first one I saw. But the earliest memories are like Friday the 13th marathons on USA. Like I would always look forward to, when an actual Friday the 13th would land because I knew that's when USA was going to run those movies. There was also an element of my parents were so the way they worded it was like they didn't want to shield me from stuff, like they didn't want to be overprotective parents. As I've gotten older, I'm starting to think that was a bullshit cover for like we want to watch the things we want to watch, and if you're going to have to be here, then we'll just say that we're expanding your horizons. So that included movies like one of the earliest memories I have is the movie Hellraiser. So this has to go back to this is at least something that was on a TV screen that I was in the room as early as like 4 or 5 years old.
Oh my God.
Which is especially interesting considering that like it is now still my favorite movie of all time. So I don't know if it just like imprinted itself on me at a young age. Like we always talk about how like usually it's that person's first foray into horror that always kind of like sticks with them and usually stays as at least one of their favorite movies. But this one, like there's no way I'm understanding what's going on in that movie as a 4 or 5 year old, but it's one that has intrigued me ever since I saw it.
Yeah. Like what do you even think watching that as a 4 or 5 year old?
Probably like variations of WoW or like, or just kind of,
a lot going
or
on
stunned silence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair.
I very clearly don't have memories of like all of the, sexual themes of the movie. It's mainly like, oh, wow, that guy's got pins coming out of his head. That's terrifying, but I want to see more. And I definitely have.
Wow.
They have such sites to show you, and you have seen
They do.
Sites.
The sites tend to be diminishing returns after the fourth one, but yeah, there's a lot of sites.
I have to watch the rest of those movies.
No, you don't.
Okay.
See 1 through 4,
Psych.
call it a day, and just pretend the other ones don't exist because that's what I've decided to do.
I mean, they get pretty bad from what I've heard from Joe.
Yeah. I guess, Joe calling me Paul Hollywood was probably just, even if it was like subconscious revenge for the fact that we had him and Annie Rose Malamet watched the entirety of the franchise for a retrospective we did for Daily Dead for Corpse Club. So yeah, I don't think I'm going to be getting Christmas cards from either of those people anytime in the near future because there is a dip in quality. Like, the first 2 are fantastic. They're like, for me, the best horror has to offer. 3 is ridiculous and stupid, but still entertaining. 4 is just so incredibly insane that I can't help but respect it. And then after that, it's really just varying degrees of eh.
Yeah, I don't really want to spend time watching a horror movie that's called eh. You know what I mean? Or any movie that's just
I don't blame you.
Eh. So you loved Hellraiser, but what were a few of your other horror favorites besides Hellraiser?
Oh boy. So in terms of like some of the gateway horror, and sorry about the pun, but The Gate is a huge one for me. That was one that I watched and rewatched a lot as a kid. And that was one that definitely left an impression in terms of like, that is a creepy movie.
It is.
Going back to it as an adult, I remember like there was probably about a 20-25 year gap between when I saw it as a kid and when I came back to it as an adult. And I'm like, all right, brace yourself for, this probably isn't going to be what you remembered. And it 100% was. It's definitely, it's definitely a kid's movie, but it's not really pulling punches in terms of putting those kids in danger. So yeah, it's a good one, and it's really creepy and atmospheric, and it's a lot of, I don't know if fun's the right word, but it's definitely, something that holds your attention whether or not you're 8 or 38.
Yeah, because we watched it for the podcast and I had never seen it before.
I hadn't either.
And I was like, okay, it'll probably be fun, but I did not realize how creepy it was going to be. Like, for me as an adult, I was like, this is not a children's movie. Like, there are children getting very hurt in this movie. A
man's face gets like pushed in and dirty dishwater pours out of it. It is so gross.
That was one that
gross.
Gave me some nightmares. Just that idea, because they're also toying with that idea of like not just any man. This is like the kid's dad or who they think is his dad.
The dad, yeah.
So that kind of whiplash turn from we're okay to oh God, we're not okay is just so rattling.
Yeah, it really is. So besides The Gate, did you have any other favorites from that time period from when you were a kid?
Oh, I was a bit of a basic fella, especially because my mom was really into 80s stuff. So pretty much all of the classic 80s stuff, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Gotcha.
The Alien movies. Yeah, so like a lot of the stuff when I was a kid was the stuff that was just like super readily available and a lot of the more mainstream stuff.
Okay. So transitioning from being a kid to being an adult, what do you think draws you to the genre or to horror now as an adult?
Oh, I think it's just kind of the way my interaction with it has evolved and turned into something that was, as a kid up through probably my mid-20s, my enjoyment of horror was, I think, like at a very superficial level, or at least a very like face value level. I liked it because it had a lot of really cool visuals, and I liked, I liked gore, and basically I was like the guy that you would probably find in like a horror Reddit thread, or like, the guys at like a lot of the comment sections for a lot of like the more popular websites. Like, I wasn't ever, I don't think, like creepy or problematic. But I also wasn't really too concerned with what it all meant, in terms of how I digested horror. It was cool. What I like is how my appreciation of it has evolved as I've gotten older, kind of seeing what horror can be beyond that kind of narrow sliver of like 80s slasher and, just kind of like as an aesthetic. It's just become in a lot of ways, it's become a lot more difficult because, horror is looking at things that are more difficult and things that people don't often want to look at. But it's also made it a lot richer of an experience.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, you get scared as a kid at these movies, but do you ever experience that kind of fear now? I know that a lot of the time with people, including Terry and I, it's, it's you get jaded after a while. So do you ever still get that childhood fear?
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of like, you build up that tolerance over the years. And I think that's definitely something that I've gotten. I think that usually movies are more going to disturb me or kind of rattle me than they're going to kind of have that visceral fear.
Yeah.
Now that said, I'm still like a sucker for a jump scare. Like it's
hell yeah.
I'm the guy who, like, if I'm watching a movie in my office and I've got headphones on and like I know something's coming, like I'll start kind of drifting the headphones above my head.
Oh yes.
Because like usually like the visuals aren't what get me for the jump scare. It's that stinger and the loud noise.
Yes.
Which is why it always pisses me off when it's like a cat or something cheap like that. Now, that said, I do remember that the last experience I had where I was just like scared down to my bones, like that little kid scared that I hadn't felt in a long time, was actually from a TV show. It was from, I don't know if either of you have seen on Netflix. It only lasted a season, but it's called Marianne.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
I didn't finish it, but I've heard such good things about it.
So there's this scene where she's the main character is, and to give a little bit of context, it's kind of this writer has basically taken this kind of witch demon entity from her childhood as a kind of a catharsis, or to kind of like trap the demon unknowingly, has become an author and written a bunch of stories about that kind of based on her experience with it through a fictional lens. But as an adult, it's kind of coming back for her and it wants to wreak havoc. And so there's this sequence where she's with her parents and the house alarm starts going off. And it's kind of that, like, I don't know if you've ever had like a house alarm system where Like if it goes off, you can actually, like, you'll get a phone call from the company and they'll ask, are you okay? And all that stuff. And so she gets one of those calls, and it's one of those things where you start to realize, like, I don't think it's actually the security company on the other end of that line. And the way they reveal that to be the case is one of those things where it's like, I don't remember the last time I actually, not from a jump scare, but just from just feeling so deeply terrified on a just kind of like an elemental level, I had to stop. Like I actually had to take a break and go like take a breath, turn a light on. And it was kind of one of those things where it was like, oh, that's what that feels like. And so it was like, it was both horrible and wonderful at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah.
I really need to watch that.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Just, with the caveat that, it ends on something of a cliffhanger and it's not going to get resolved because Netflix doesn't like to keep good shows going. But it's also like, I would say it wraps up enough that it's at least a pretty satisfying, story, like a season of story.
Cool.
What would you say are your favorite horror movies as an adult?
So obviously Hellraiser, like I said. I'm also a really big fan of Phantasm.
Oh, okay.
Boy.
Boy. And that's one of those movies that it's hard for me to describe just because it's one of those movies that are just like, it's so like surreal and there's so much dream logic. And it's also one that I think for a lot of people just kind of comes across as low budget B-movie schlock. Like there are some people who watch it because they like to kind of laugh along with it, but it's one that resonates with me at a much deeper level. And it's kind of one of the first movies that introduced me to the idea that horror can be more than face value.
Oh.
And I actually I've told this story a couple of times, but it's one of those things where I credit Faculty of Horror with kind of opening those doors to me, because they did an episode on Phantasm, and they kind of just talked about all of the themes about like, male teenage adolescence and kind of fear of abandonment and all these things that as they're ticking them off, I'm like, oh yeah, I grew up like I was a single parent household. It was just me and my dad from the time I was like 6 on. And I was like low key always kind of terrified, as I think a lot of kids of single parents are. Like, you don't necessarily know how to articulate it, but like there's always that like, well, what if something happens to this person? Like, what if they leave me either of their own accord or for, circumstances outside of their control? And kind of connecting those dots with why I liked Phantasm so much is kind of what really just kind of blew the gates open for me and looking at horror in a different way.
Wow.
And so it's a movie that I appreciate for kind of being that catalyst for me. It's also just like, it's just a creepy movie. It's got a really great soundtrack. Angus Scrimm does so much with like 3 lines of dialogue.
Right? It's wild.
And I also just love kind of the whole like independent guerrilla style of filming that they did. Like this was a movie that Don Coscarelli's parents paid. I think his parents like funded most of it. They shot on weekends, like whenever they could get people together. They kept people plied with like Dos Equis beer the whole time just to kind of keep everybody in good spirits. And it's just one of those things that like happened to come together as this really affecting horror movie.
I need to give it another shot. I remember trying to watch it, I think, during one of the like drive-in things when I think he did it once. And I had a hard time getting into it. I bought the big set of it. So I have all what, like
I'm just laughing at you because you're like, I can't get into it, but I also bought the entire set.
You don't know if it's not going to be available. And what if you end up finding out that you love it and then you can't get the physical media ever again?
Don't look. I have regretted that multiple times in my life. I don't need that has happened to me a couple of times.
That is horror fandom in a nutshell, though. It's like, I don't really like this movie. I own everyone in the franchise, but
I mean, it's like the Jason one. I'm not a huge Friday the 13th fan, but I bought that fucking Blu-ray set because
you did.
Who knows? You might need it at some point in your life.
I liked Midsommar, but was not obsessed with it, and I still spent $50 on that fucking A24 Blu-ray release.
We're not going to talk about that purchase. Okay, so transitioning like away from this kind of semi-depressing but also not topic to great stuff. Can you tell us what you do at Daily Dead?
Yes. So I've got a couple of recurring columns on there that I do. The first one that I started is called Catalog from the Beyond. It's a fairly simple premise. It's, I take a horror icon, either actor or director, someone well known, and just take a look at some of their maybe lesser known stuff. I still remember the first thing I ever did for Daily Dead was I did David Cronenberg, but I did History of Violence.
Oh,
I always
cool.
forget that he directed that.
It's actually my favorite Cronenberg movie. Like, I absolutely adore that movie, partially because I'm just a big Viggo Mortensen fan. I love Maria Bello, but it's another one that's hard to describe because it's this slice of Americana, just like jammed against the brick wall of like the repercussions of violence and those themes that kind of permeate David Cronenberg movies. And it's just one that, I just like, it's such a small story. And I think I really like small stories, especially small stories that like hint at bigger stuff. So like it's this little family story, but there's these connections to like organized crime and things like that. But it's just so like very focused. So that was the first one I ever did for Daily Dead. And I've been doing that for, I think I started in 2016. So this will be my 5th year doing that. Yeah.
Wow. Congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah. It's, I don't have the output that like, Scott Drebit, who does drive-in dust-offs, like he does that shit once a week. I do it once a month. And even that is like, I don't get how he does it. He's a robot. He's a machine. And they're all good too. It takes me a lot of effort to put out one of these a month and have something that I think is like readable. He's just like, yeah, every Saturday. Fuck you. Love you, Scott.
Wow.
What that is wild. Like once a week.
Yeah.
That's insane.
So yeah, I've been doing that for 5 years, but like, my 50th one is coming up like next month. So it's not like I'm just like, firing out like a bunch of these, a month or anything like that.
That's still a lot. That's a long time to keep a column going. That's something to be proud of.
Thank you. Yeah, admittedly, I did need to take a little bit of a pandemic break in the second half of 2020 just because I was juggling a few different things and there was just only so much like brain bandwidth. So something had to go for a little while, and that was the one I took a break on.
I don't understand that at all. I don't know why the pandemic would cause that to happen.
Yeah, we have all this free time now. Shouldn't we be so much more productive? Shut the fuck up.
It's so true.
So yeah, I've been doing that. And one of the other things that, I'm actually really proud of, the other column that I started, I guess this will be about a year and a half ago. It's called Let's Scare Bryan to Death. One of the things that, I admit to, and we talked about this earlier, is that like I had a very kind of narrow focus in terms of the horror movies that I watched as a kid and up through my early to mid 20s. And so I love horror, but my horror education isn't what it could be. And so I started this column basically to get like really cool people who know about horror to introduce me to new horror movies. And so it's an interview with people who have, written in horror. Some, I've talked to some directors. I've talked to, some actors. The only criteria for this interview is that the movie we talk about has to be one I haven't seen before, which is usually pretty easy. Like if you toss me a list of 3 to 5 movies, there's at least one in there that I'm not going to have seen. This has come together, and I just really, really like the opportunity this has given me to talk to really cool people. Like the first one I ever did was with Andrea Subasati from Faculty of Horror and from Morgue. She introduced me to The Evil Within, the movie from I think like 2017 that was made by that guy from, I think he was like from the Hearst family or something like that. Had a lot of mental health issues, but he put like $5 million of his own money into making like this passion project that is such a glorious hot mess that is, you can't call it bad. It's super rough around the edges, and it goes into some really weird territory. But considering it was made by a guy who's never made a movie before, it is a very interesting movie. And so it's also one that I never would have bothered seeing like on my own. So that's the kind of thing. And I've seen such great movies through this and talked to such great people. It's something that I really enjoy doing, and I'm glad I've gotten the opportunity to do it.
That's rad.
That's awesome.
And I guess like as a little bit of a hint, people who like this podcast and like Terry and Mary Beth, keep an eye out for some of their voices that might be coming up in the very near future.
I'm very excited.
Me too.
Okay, so Bryan, what movie are we talking about today?
We are talking 1984's The NeverEnding Story.
Turn
NeverEnding Story.
Gang, if we're going to sing off key, we at least need to be on the same lines.
I know. You think we would have planned that out a little bit better.
No. Anyway, we're just gonna sing that whole song like 4 times. That's the entire episode.
And just get the episode like pulled down for copyright strikes. It's fine.
Okay, so for those of you who have never seen The NeverEnding Story, the film is about Bastian, a shy, outcast bibliophile who lives with his widowed father and is tormented by bullies each morning who throw him into a fucking dumpster. Who does that? On one occasion, he escapes into a bookshop where the old proprietor reveals an ancient storybook to him, which he is warned can be dangerous. Shortly after he borrows the book and begins to read it in the school attic, he is drawn into the mythical land of Fantasia, which desperately needs a hero to save it from destruction.
Turn around.
It's the never-ending story.
Okay, so
I'm just trying to think of like a random part of that song that I can throw into the mix.
okay, to be honest, those are like literally the only lyrics I know. Is like that turnaround part and the never-ending story part. I hummed this music when I watched this last night again for the first time in who knows how many years, but like I don't know the lyrics, so the
lyrics are gobbledygook anyway. Like you listen to that song because it has a really catchy melody and the singing is really good, but who cares about the words other than turn around and never-ending story?
At one point they sing about rainbows, like whatever.
I mean, this is sort of like, that's pretty par for the course for a lot of 80s music. No offense to 80s music fans, but
no, that's true. Anyway, okay. Bryan, tell us your horror story about this. How old were you? What terrified you? Give us the story.
So I will say this is another one that I couldn't tell you the first time I saw it because this is my childhood in a nutshell. And I've got a very conflicted, I wouldn't even say it's conflicted, but it's like there's a very kind of, I don't know, dualistic relationship with this movie because it is one that like I have adored with my whole heart ever since I was very young, but also as a young kid, absolutely dreaded watching it because there are such scarring scenes in this movie. And it's a different kind of scarring in terms of, I know we, as a horror podcast, you focus a lot on like the stuff that like scares you and gives you nightmares. This is more of like an introduction. This is like existential dread. My first existential dread, which is funny because for all these movies that like I've seen as a little kid that I probably shouldn't have seen, like all the R-rated stuff that I probably had no business watching, the stuff that messed with my head the most is the one that was actually geared towards children because, we talk about The Gate being like bringing up these very kind of adult themes and putting kids into dangerous situations. This is making you think about like as a 30-year-old or a 37-year-old, it's hard for me to put this into words, but it's like I said, it's this existential dread because it's talking about things like what it means to like exist and what your ability of the imagination to like make things real. It was never a movie that gave me nightmares, but it's definitely one that, scarred me in different ways. And I think first and foremost, of course, the scene with Atrax is the one. Let's get this one out of the way because, if we're going to cry, let's do it now. Sorry, Terry, you're going to say something?
No, I'm just like, I'm sighing because that was a scene that is like lived rent free in my head since I saw this. I don't know how old I was when I saw this. So I knew the moment that you said that this was the movie you wanted to talk about, I was like, well, there's 2 things in particular that jump out at me. And the one that really does is poor Atrax. So let's unpack that. So how did this scene, what did it do to you? How did you react to this scene? I'm curious.
It ruined me. Like it was just like ugly sobbing as a kid watching this movie and including repeat viewings because I watched this movie a lot as a kid. And so just like I knew it was coming every time. And it was also kind of one of those weird things where it was like, it's that scab that you can't stop picking at. Like there's a fast forward button. I could have gone past it, but it's like part of part of enjoying this movie and part of kind of like enjoying what's good about this movie is getting through like the really awful parts like this. And it's just, it's so effective because it's also not like, it's not cheap. Like it's so well done. And it's kind of that scene where it's like, oh, this movie has some fucking stakes to it.
Yeah.
And it's, like if nothing else, it introduces the idea that like, not only do horses have emotions, but they can give in to despair.
Oh.
And so it's just like, and I think part of what is also so effective about it is that, Noah Hathaway, the kid that plays Atreyu, absolutely kills the acting in this scene. Like this kid goes through every stage of grief except for acceptance in this one scene. From that very second where like the camera is following him and he's pulling Atrax along and just like there's that jolt where he stops and he slowly turns his head back and he's like, he knows something's wrong, but he's not quite ready to like accept what is actually wrong. So like there's that, you know, that whole sequence where he's like, oh, I get it. It's too hard for you. And then he sees he's sinking and he just goes from like, oh God, like freaking out to, panicking to actually yelling at Atrax. And also like, not only is Noah Hathaway acting really well, that horse is acting its ass off in this scene.
No, it really is. And in fact, I was so curious about this scene as an adult that I went down like some Google search rabbit holes, and I found that there is a behind the scenes making of documentary in German that's like translate or has like subtitles for English. It's on YouTube, and they spent 7 weeks training this horse to stand on a hydraulic and allow the muck to go up to its face. Like they showed some of the behind the scenes with like the trainer of trying to like get the horse to not shy away, get it to not whinny, get it to not react, and just stand there as the hydraulic is lowering it into that gunk. So like 7 weeks process just for this one scene. And it actually put the whole production behind because of that. But that horse, you're absolutely right. And I noticed it so much as an adult rewatching this time, where you see like when you see its teeth and you see it like just not moving while it's pulling on it, and the horse has this terrified look in his eye. Like the horse is, I mean, unfortunately, I think it was probably like really literally terrified.
Yeah, I mean, like, because I remember you all talking about Phenomena and like the scene with the monkey where it's like freaking out, and like I remember talking about it, like, you know, I'm sure the SPCA wasn't on set for that. That's exactly what I was thinking the last time I was watching this. Just like, that horse is clearly freaking out. Like it's not happy.
No.
I hope it was well fed or well paid, or, you know, however a horse is whatever transaction happens for a horse in exchange for its acting services. I hope it was well paid.
Yeah, me too. You know, I was thinking back to this scene because I was trying to remember what my reaction to this movie was. Like you, it was part of my childhood. I remember watching this movie a whole lot. When I was a kid, if there was a movie that I loved, I tended to like rewatch it over and over and over again. And I know this one was one. And I hadn't seen it since I was a kid, but like the moment I sat down and I saw Bastian at the table trying to fiddle with this jar that he couldn't get open, I was like, oh, I remember this movie. Like it brought me instantly back to being a kid and watching this. And the Atrax scene is like I said, it's something that has lived rent free in my head, because I believe this was the first time, my first real experience with death. I say that, but then like I used to watch like Star Wars, but like a death that like isn't,
that has consequences.
Yes, that has like stakes to it. It's not Ben Kenobi just like vanishing in his cloak, because then at that point I don't see it as a death. Even though he died, I never really saw that as a kid. I never really put two and two together that, oh, he's dead now. He's just now like this invisible sort of like force that's talking to Luke. So like this scene was the first time there was like actual stakes attached to a death, and it hurt.
And it still hurts. Like I've seen this movie, I think at this point, it has to be at least 30 plus times, just counting all the times I've seen it as a kid. And I watched it last night getting ready for this. And I'll be honest, I'm one of those people who like, you know, I know animal death is like a really big sticking point for a lot of people in horror movies. And I don't know if because I was subjected to it so much as a kid, like I'm a little desensitized to it in a lot of other movies.
I am too, unfortunately.
Yeah. In this one, right back to being 5 years old and just like, oh God, like I could feel it welling up. And it was kind of one of those things where it was like, okay, like we're going to get past this. Like it's okay. You know, the horse comes back. Sort of. We'll get to that later. But like it's going to be okay. Like I had to kind of like calm myself down a little bit because I was reverting back to like 5 or 6 year old Bryan.
So I do think we need to talk about the sort of elephant in the room or the other art. I was trying to make it. There is an elephant in the one scene at the Ivory Tower. But Mary Beth, this was your first time watching this movie, and I've kind of gotten the feeling that you liked it, but aren't as much on board on it as maybe Bryan and I would be. Yeah. I'm curious what your experience was watching this as an adult.
So, okay, to preface this and making excuses for myself, I had to go into work today, first world problems of someone who works from home, and I was very tired from interacting with the human race. But I was watching it, and my boyfriend has seen it, and he was watching it over my shoulder, and he was like, "Oh, I remember this part," and I was like, "The Atrax," and I'll talk about this part. So I was like, I was waiting for this scene. I was like, "Oh my God, I know this is coming. It's going to be so emotional," and then it happens really early in the movie, and I wasn't expecting that. I think I was a little thrown off by how early it happens, and I don't think I was as upset as I know a lot of people are, but I was more kind of crushed by the fact that the horse gave up, like is depressed and is like given into despair.
Right?
Like,
horses get sad? What the hell? Yeah.
Horses. So that part was more like mentally jarring. I didn't dislike it. I liked it. I just think it was cheesier than I expected.
So this is not a subtle movie by any stretch of the imagination. And I guess it's one of those things where like a lot of kids movies aren't going to be terribly subtle, but it's definitely something I noticed on this last watch that I agree. I didn't realize just how early the Atrax scene happens in the movie. Like there's not a lot of interaction between Atreyu and his horse before the horse dies.
And that was my thought too. I was like, I thought there was going to be this like beautiful like character building between the two of them, and like they were going to get to know, like we're going to get this like relationship between the boy and his horse. And then I think I just built it up in my head. Like having not seen it, I was like, oh, there's no, like they have to be best friends. And then it happens, and I was like, oh.
And I think
I didn't realize they were friends, like so close.
I think if you're watching this as a 6-year-old, the couple of scenes that you get, like where they're by the creek and like Atrax wakes him up and like they have lunch and like you kind of get that banter and that, well, not banter because he's talking to a horse that doesn't talk back, but you get enough of that relationship that like for a kid, that tells you all you need to know about this. And I think there's a lot of that shorthand in this in terms of like, you don't spend a lot of time with anybody other than Atreyu and with Bastion. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for me to separate to what degree I think that works anyway, just because it works, and what degree I'm just remembering that as a 6-year-old. And so it's just it's so kind of permeated my being that like, yeah, of course this is how it all plays out. And, of course this happens, like this horrible horse death happens like 20 minutes into the movie before you even really get to see them interact all that much. I think it's one of those movies that like is counting on you. Like this is a movie about imagination. So I think it's probably counting on these kids to like fill in a lot of the blanks. And so if it's something where you're seeing it and you're not getting that, and you're watching this with kind of a more, when you don't have the nostalgia goggles on, there's probably going to be something missing there. At least I can see that happening.
Yeah. Also Falcor freaked me out.
You know what? I loved him as a kid. Watching it last night, he freaked me out a little bit too. Like the animatronics on that are so
It's uncanny valley to me, I think. I was texting Terry about this and I was like, there is something about this movie that is so uncanny valley to me. Like everything almost looks like it's still a fantasy, obviously, but everything almost looks like it's supposed to be like a fantasy creature, but there's like very weird human, like his eyes and the way his voice.
I think it's the eyes. It's the eyes. I was noticing this on this watch because I was like, man, the eyes in this movie are so well done. Like Falcor's eyes have a lot of emotion to them, and even Gmork's eyes, when all you see is the green eyes, they look like they could be real eyes. And so I think that when you put that with this larger than life puppet that I realized for the first time actually has scales. I didn't realize this as a kid. I don't know if it's because you're watching like a beta or VHS copy, and so the quality isn't the greatest. But I was like, oh, he actually has scales and fur. I just thought he was like just a flying dog when I was a kid.
So that's what I thought he was a flying dog. I always had the image that he was. I was telling this to Steve, my partner. I was like, I thought the Falcor was a flying dog. I didn't realize he was actually a dragon. And Steve has read the book before he saw the movie, and he was telling me like all the discrepancies between the two.
Oh yeah.
And he was just like, Falcor is cute, but like he's not the dragon I thought he was going to be. And I was like, tell me more. But the other thing I wanted to say was something I texted Terry was that, especially in the first Ivory Tower scene where all those humanoids are gathered together, I said, it looks like someone did acid, looks at a Hieronymus Bosch painting and said, let's do some fucking creature design for the NeverEnding Story. Like
those big giant heads. Oh, the heads were they were far out.
The multi-face people.
And then there was like this little kid in a weird like tinsely fairy costume that like stuck out to me behind Atreyu at one point, and I was like, what is going on here? I love it. I want more of this, because it was just so bizarre.
And I think part of what I love about this, like I loved it as a kid, I think what I appreciate what they're doing is that they're kind of giving you like this slice of Fantasia life. Like they're not going to get too much into the mythology of these creatures, but they're just going to show you like this is a land where there's a lot of different beings. Like we're not just talking like it's not just anthropomorphic folks. Like there's just big walking heads. Yeah, and like Terry, like you said, like there's people with like the divided faces.
And there was one that had like, it was like two faces morphed into one where there was three eyes and the center eye was like shared between the two faces. It's so bizarre.
Part of what I love about it, like it's so off the wall, but it's also presenting, like it's not presenting these creatures as threatening. Like there's almost like a little bit of like a Nightbreed-esque feeling to it, where it's like in another story, like these could be monsters. We're introduced to, this little guy with a top hat, Deep Roy, with his top hat and his racing snail.
I screamed Deep Roy when he came on screen. I was like, oh my God, I love Deep Roy.
Which, of course, they kind of ruin a little bit by dubbing his voice. But, that's not to, that's to be expected in 1984, I suppose. You have this Rockbiter, which is great, but also that'll be another scarring scene we'll talk about for later in the movie. And then there's like this guy and his bat.
Oh, Nighthawk and his snoozy bat.
That's the exact kind of thing, like I talked about that Nightbreed feel. Like I feel like in any other movie, that would be like the henchman bad guy. And here he's just like this goofy little guy who uses a bat as a hang glider.
What I loved about this opening scene, and particularly watching it as an adult, was that you have this idea of it presents different characters from around the world of Fantasia, because they all come from different corners, and they've all come together, and they have during this scene and then throughout the rest of the movie have created their own little found family that is because of this idea of shared trauma of this world. Their world is unraveling. Their homes are destroyed. They have nothing to go back to. And so they have found each other, and they are completely opposite. You have a Rockbiter that's gnawing things. You have Nighthawk and his snoozy bat, and you have Teeny Weeny and his racing snail. Like they shouldn't have anything in common. And Rockbiter is initially presented as being kind of a scary thing. He's just rolling through on his like a scooter, and it's so cute.
It's so good.
But they all get together and they form a little family unit. And that is our introduction to Fantasia. It's not through Atreyu. It's not through the hero story. It is through this little group of people that have come together because they have nowhere else to go. And that really hit me as an adult.
I really love that because I again, like, didn't expect it. And I was like, oh, this is really sweet. Like, are we going to get some, again, I knew nothing about this movie. I don't know why I didn't see it as a kid. I think it freaked my mom out and she was just like, no, you don't need to see it. I don't know why. But I was like, oh, are these going to be cute little cute vignettes about different parts of the world? Like, I was like, this is such a sweet way to look at Fantasia. And then sad things happen later.
Like immediately. Yeah.
Like immediately. Like,
and I think that's part of what I appreciate about it too. Like, just from a storytelling perspective, it's almost like kicking off it's almost like a really good, and Terry, you'll appreciate this, like a really good D&D scenario where it's like, oh
my God, yes.
How do we set up the kickoff to a campaign or an adventure that brings all these people together? And it's like, well, this is something, they're all kind of coming together because there's something that's threatening their entire world. And then you get to have all these disparate characters that you wouldn't normally group together. It's kind of one of those things that I look at a lot more now that I've been doing like role-playing games where, like, when you're making these games, like, you keep having to come up with, like, why are these people together? And so when I see that done well in an actual movie or a book, it's like I appreciate it that much more because I know how fucking hard it is. So to have done that here is really cool, and to take that opportunity and lean into making these different creatures, like really leaning into making it elaborate and making them different. I appreciate all the work that went into that.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier that, this movie isn't exactly subtle, but I will say that there are moments in this that I think are incredibly well done in a subtle sort of way. For instance, I really like Morla, this giant turtle that Atreyu climbs on the back of, thinking it's a mountain, and then it raises and then he falls. And I mean, you got to give it up for the kid, first of all, that he's constantly like being tossed off of trees, going through, but like, this isn't a very physical shoot for this poor kid. But what I liked about Morla is it kind of is a callback scene to his father, and in Bastian's father, and in the opening scene where Bastian is obviously not over his mom's death, but his father's like, yeah, you just gotta buck up and keep continuing on.
Oh,
it's
and
like
also, I'm going to drink this mixture of orange juice and raw eggs.
Okay, thank you. I thought I was going crazy. I was like, did he just crack a fucking egg into that blender?
He cracked two eggs into that blender.
Right? Okay, thank you. Because I was like, and then he drank it. And I was like, did I miss? Am I what?
I remember, like, the 80s had real weird ideas about, like, fitness and health. And, like, I think that kind of goes back to, like, Rocky drinking the raw eggs for the protein and stuff like that. But I'm just like, did you need to mix it with the orange juice? That is nauseating.
I agree.
Sorry, Terry. That's neither here nor there.
Can't give up on work as he drinks this nasty ass concoction and tells his son not to be sad about his mom dying.
Like, you're going to have to give up on work when you get food poisoning from drinking raw eggs, Major Dad.
I'm just, the dad, that's the whole point, but I got so upset. This poor kid, his mom has died, and I'm assuming it was probably relatively recently. And he's like, you didn't try it for the swim team. And like, I just don't understand
your head is
why.
in the clouds.
Yeah, like you're not like achieving your full potential. Like the kid is like probably 10.
Walk it off, son.
Or younger.
Walk it off.
Walk off this trauma. It's fine.
But that was also like the prototypical father of the 80s. Like that was,
yeah, that's true.
That is how fatherhood was presented in the 80s. It was like, we can't show our emotions. We have to be stoic. We can't quote unquote coddle our sons. We have to just, cheerio, go buck forward and go take on the day, regardless of how you are potentially dying inside. And that's what I really liked about Morla, because Morla shows up and she becomes, I'm not quite sure, becomes a symbol of adulthood, cynicism, and apathy that is represented in the father. So you have like Morla constantly saying, not that it matters, or actually we don't care, or we don't even care whether we care or not, or like this kind of disdain for youth where they literally say we're allergic to youth. It's this being that is presented as all-knowing, is presented as being the person that could potentially save the universe and save Atreyu, save Bastian, save everyone. And they couldn't give a shit about anything.
But also, like, I think to that note, and I think this fits along kind of with what you're talking about, in the end, Atreyu calls more on their bullshit by saying, like, if you really didn't care, you would just tell me. So you care, but there's something going on here. Like, you don't know how to express your emotions. And like, you know, they get called on it. So, and I think that fits kind of perfectly with what you're saying with this, you know, this dad, this 80s dad who is probably has all kinds of stuff going on inside himself that he has no capacity to handle because no one's taught him how to deal with his emotions. And now, unfortunately, he's like trying to pass this way of life onto his kid.
And the line that Morless says that really just like really got me this time was when Atreyu was saying that, you know, the nothing will kill them too. And they're like, well, that at least would be something. Like they are so, they've given up so much on anything that like the idea of just like dying is like, oh, well, that'd be something, I guess. That is their reaction to all of it. And it's such a subtle thing. It's such a subtle callback, but I do think it is a callback to the father, because then we also get just a little bit later, Engiwook and Urgel, two wonderful names of two people that represent the kind of pull that is happening for Bastian in the world, where his father wants him to have, keep your head out of the clouds. You have to like focus on math, on the sciences and stuff. And that is with Engelwook, where he's like, you know, I'm doing all these like scientific things and trying to study the world. And then you have his wife that he keeps calling wench, but she is like the mysticism. She is the magic. She is that sort of like, she's making potions. She's taking all these different disparate like ingredients and concocting weird things to help Bastian. And you have the two of them together, and they don't really call it out, but it's basically science versus, you know, dreaming, that kind of marriage between having your feet on the ground, but also maybe your head in the clouds for a little bit.
And that's interesting too, because it's, you know, obviously it's contentious to a degree, but they've also clearly been married for a long time.
Yeah.
So it works. It's also just, it's probably one of the sweetest segments of the movie, just watching these two little old people, little like in the most literal sense of the word, because like these creatures are like what they come up to Atreyu's like waist or something like that.
The use of forced perspective in this movie is so good to like trick the imagination into thinking people are smaller than they are. It's so, or bigger than they are for that matter.
Also, just noticed for the first time watching it this time, Urgel is played by Patricia Hayes, which is a connection to another one of my beloved 80s movies from a kid. She played Finn Rizal in Willow.
Oh.
Yeah. And I never put two and two together as a kid, but I was watching it this time. I'm like, I know that voice. I'm pretty sure that's Finn Rizal. And I looked it up, and sure enough, yes, that is Finn Rizal.
That's where I recognized the voice from. Okay. They also reminded me of, well, one, Willow. Please, someone come talk about Willow, because I love Willow.
I'll just stay on. We can just continue into Willow when we're done with
Cool.
this.
Sweet. They kind of reminded me of the couple from The Princess Bride.
Yeah.
A little bit. I was like, I need every fantasy movie to have a cute older couple that like kind of hate each other, but also really love each other. And it's very endearing. Like, I am like, this is a good trope. Can we continue to have this? This is very good.
My biggest laugh of the movie is when he's so excited after Atreyu gets through the first gate. He comes down and he falls out of the bucket, and he goes to tell his wife. She's like, and she sees him all done. She's like, that's no reason to fall out of the basket again.
I know. As she's like standing on top of Falcor and giving him like
shot of vitamins,
vaccinations, like
juicy vitamins.
Like, ew.
I love her. Oh my god. So thinking about them, I just had like an idea that like something that popped into my head that I hadn't thought about. But this film feels very post-apocalyptic in a way that I was not expecting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously the nothing is sweeping through and destroying and taking everything away. I didn't really think about the idea of the post-apocalypse in this way. You know what I mean? Like, we always think of the post-apocalypse as like our society being gone, but this is a really interesting look at like a fantasy post-apocalypse, which again, did not expect watching this movie, but that was really harrowing.
Yeah, the nothing is something that I think actually freaks me out more now than it did when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as a kid, it's just like, that's the big bad. But now kind of looking at it as this, one of the things that I've found is really scary to me is this idea of the sublime, which is, you know, a lot of people, when you think sublime, you think like ecstasy or something like that. And sublime, like in some contexts has a very different meaning. It's actually something brought up in, I think, Frankenstein, where sublime is something that's so large and so vast that you kind of can't even comprehend it, kind of like getting into Lovecraftian thoughts. Mm-hmm. So it's like, for me, like if I'm at the beach and I'm looking at the ocean, like my mind sometimes will go to like, this could easily swallow us all. Like if something shifted the wrong way, or like this is bigger than any of us will ever be. Turning that into the never-ending story and just like this vast nothingness, just it's like, it's literally kind of like looking into the abyss, is just so terrifying to me. And that's also as someone who is like agnostic leaning atheist, who has to like kind of reconcile that with like, okay, so what is going to happen when I go? And so like one of the scary thoughts is like, what if it is just nothing? Like what if I'm here 1 second and just like gone from the universe the next? So bringing that kind of baggage into this movie is something that makes the nothing a lot freakier to me now.
Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah.
It made me think of depression too. Like being very depressed, and the idea, and like making me think about as a kid that like I didn't know what depression was, but I had that feeling. And that was pretty like hard to think about as I was watching it. I was like, oh God, oh no. And I mean, I don't think I would have thought it was depression when I was younger, but watching it now, it's like like in my head, you know, when you're depressed, everything kind of just disappears. So that is what I saw it as well.
Well, and I also think, kind of going with that, you know, the idea of the nothingness, and you see it tied to, if you see it tied to this idea of depression or of nothingness, that is basically what both Bastian and his father are trying to stay away from, right? Because this grief of the mother is all encompassing. The mother's death is all encompassing. And there are two different ways of trying to basically stay ahead of that thought and that idea. And so you have the adult who is basically trying to be apathetic toward it and just kind of carry on. And you have the son that is drawing unicorns in his math book and is moving into more fantasy realms to try to cope with that depression, basically. So the idea that this kid is falling into this fantasy world, but then this fantasy world is also being enveloped by depression, and the thing that ends up saving the end of the day is him naming his mom and coming to terms with his mom's death is such a strong message in like a kid's movie. That's not, I guess on the negative side, I would say that I don't think it necessarily moves to that epiphany very well, but it is there. I think maybe it might have been stripped away because this movie did get edited a whole bunch. So I'm wondering if there is something more to it that was released over in Germany, because I know Steven Spielberg did the cut that is released here in the US. Like he edited it down and took out like 7 minutes of movie from this too.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, Terry, because it's based off of a novel of the same name, written by Michael Ende. I might be completely butchering his last name, but that's how I'm going to say it, because that's the only way I can think to say it. But he was initially very excited that his book was going to get adapted, and actually took a fairly small fee for it just because he was so thrilled about the idea. And then apparently William Peterson, I wouldn't say went rogue, but basically without Ende's knowledge, did some major rewrites to the screenplay that Ende really didn't like, and he actually wanted nothing to do with it.
He sued to halt production.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Wow.
And it's also interesting too because if you look at what happens in the book, this movie only covers the first half. And the sequel that came out, I think in 92, is actually kind of an adaptation of the second half of the novel. And I think one of the things, Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, that Ende really took issue with is to kind of your point that there's no real, other than saying his mom's name, there's no real kind of active participation from Bastian's point up until that last very second. And I think that's what he really took issue with, that it's just kind of like this reveal at the end, and there's no active effort from Bastian other than, it's a very dramatic scene. But essentially all he's doing is yelling a name out into the great beyond. And I think Ende had more of an idea of the way he had it imagined, Bastian takes a lot more of an active role in how this all comes together.
Yeah, that's what my partner was telling me. And he was like, the ending of the book was better. And he was telling me about it. I'm like, I don't even think they could have smashed all that in there, though. Just like the legacy of Bastian and all that stuff. But I will say something I really did enjoy is Bastian saying things like run at his book, because it was so relevant to how I used to read books as a kid, and like
Yes.
Yelling at the pages and being like an active participant in the story. I think, like you said, there is an interesting disconnect between that aspect and then him actually becoming like an active participant in the world of Fantasia. Like that's a little bit jarring, but I really loved like the representations of a kid reading a book and just like getting sucked into it. And that made me just took me back to when I like, because I love to read and I was like a voracious reader as a kid. And so those moments were really, I think, special.
My favorite part, actually, with going along with this is actually when Bastian, the school is out, the bell is rung, he's collecting his things and he's going to run down the stairs, and then he stops and he's like, no, I gotta continue this. And that is like, yes, that is the way it felt like when you're a kid reading. If you got sucked into a book and you're like, I gotta see this through to the end because these characters are counting on me. You know, I've left them in such a predicament, and if I don't keep reading, then the story is not going to continue. And it makes you sort of feel like an active participant in the actual art of reading a book. And I thought this movie, for all of the like iffy, maybe plotting points, especially towards the end, that was something that it captured perfectly for me.
It definitely did. Also, I went to school with an attic like that.
Oh, I know, right?
What the fuck? It's like, what? My public school did not have that, because if it did, I would never have gone to class.
With the key just in like this broken box that anyone can get to.
I was like, I don't know what school this is, but I dig it. It just grabs him out of a broken glass thing and runs into the attic.
Continuing on with this book thing, the other scene that like really got me thinking this time was early on in the movie, but it was with the shopkeep, where he's having a conversation with Bastian about the books that he's reading, and Bastian's talking about, you know, that he has 180 some odd books, and the shopkeep says, well, your books are safe. While you're reading them, you get to be Tarzan or Robinson Crusoe, but afterwards you get to be a little boy again. And I got to thinking about this idea of like those books or, you know, any media. I mean, this podcast is kind of about, you know, that media that we saw maybe too young or whatever, that just like either broke our brain or made us think about things differently. And I thought about that with these books, in particular, the book that, you know, the kid reads that ends up helping him work through his trauma of losing his mom, that there are books out there that are quote unquote dangerous, the ones that will change how you see or experience the world, and it fundamentally changes you. And I'm curious if you guys ever had books like that growing up that you remember reading and just remembering that this was that book.
Yeah, mine was The Green Mile by Stephen King. And I always come back to that one because that was the first book I've read and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed after reading it. Like, I love to read, and I had like, you know, strong connections to the books I read, but I never cried like this before after reading a book. And I don't think I had ever read something that was so beautiful and had really gotten me to the core about what it means to be a person. And for like, I don't know, something about it just hit me in a way that I had never been hit before by the written word. And it changed the way I read books, I think, for sure. And like the emotional expectations with books and my emotional relationship to books in a good way. And really understanding like the kinds of feelings novels can really draw out of you. I think I read it too young too, but that's fine.
And I guess this is where I have to admit that like I don't have the same relationship with books as I do with like movies and TV and kind of visual media. I definitely read, but I don't have that connection with books. I can't point to a book and say like this is something that changed the way I view things. It's more like moments in TV and media and things that have kind of like ruined me in various ways. You know, that's the media that has the power for me to do that. And I think the moment that last did that for me wasn't horror by any stretch of the imagination. It was actually in the first season of Pose, when Billy Porter's character, Pray Tell, is, this is a lot of this movie is about the AIDS, epidemic or pandemic in, mid 80s New York. And he's just got this scene where he's basically saying goodbye to his boyfriend in this god awful, I think, like Bronx hospital room. And it's one of those things where it's like, these are the kinds of things like I've read about the conditions back then. I've read about how many people died. But for me to see that play out between these two people that I've been following and grown an attachment to, it's probably the hardest I've cried in like 10 years.
I'm getting emotional just thinking about that scene.
It is a very difficult scene to watch. But it's also like you realize that you're watching stuff like this for those scenes to make those connections that you've maybe made mentally, but haven't felt them in any kind of substantial way. And I think that's what movies do for me. Like it's hard for me to get there in a book, but in movies and TV, like it's a lot easier for me to immerse myself in a way where I feel it in ways that I might not feel in a book.
Yeah, that makes sense. For me, and I've mentioned this this character's death on this podcast before, but I was a huge fantasy novel reader when I was a kid, and there was one series called the Dragonlance Chronicles, and it was originally a set of 3 books, and there's a character, his name was Flint, and he was a dwarf, and you get this sort of like they kind of get together, and this group in a way that kind of feels similar to like the NeverEnding Story, and you follow them on their journeys. And in the 3rd book of this original trilogy, Flint ends up dying, but he ends up dying because of a heart attack. It's not like it's not because he dies in like, the great thrall of battle or whatever, defending the world. He has literally gotten so old, and you see throughout the books that he's getting older because he's started out the books as an old dwarf. And so in that book, when he just sort of like gives out because his heart has given up, that I remember throwing that book across the room, and it was like 6 months before I would pick it up again to like read it because I was so upset and I didn't want to believe that it was possible.
God.
Yeah.
What the fuck were we reading and doing as children?
I know, right?
Like, we were not okay. Like, I'm like just thinking about the things I read, and I was like, what the hell? Like, I just continuously traumatizing myself, and I don't regret it, but it's just funny looking back. It's like my mom was like, oh, well, you're pretty advanced for your age for reading, so like, do whatever you want. And I was like, oh no. Oh no. Oh no.
Even I know this is a bad idea.
I know. It's like, probably not a good call, but here we go. And I don't regret it. It's just funny to look back on and think about.
To bring it back to the movie, though, particularly with this idea of failure, and I think you had mentioned this earlier that we'd get to, so I want to make sure that we talked about it, Brian. But Rockbiter,
they look like big, strong hands, don't they?
Oh my God. Okay, I keep feeling like I'm gonna cry talking about this. So obviously this movie had an impact on me as we keep talking about it, because I'm like getting very emotional.
I am too.
Oh boy.
That moment where it's like, but he also is a stand-in for. He's sort of the father figure of this group. He's the big guy. He's the protector. He's the one that is like larger than the rest of these almost kid size people, the hob or the night hob and teeny weeny and stuff. And that thing, like you were saying, Brian, where they look like big, good, strong hands, don't they? And then talking about how the nothing pulled them right out of his hands and he failed. It brought me back to like the father and this sort of like idea of what the father figure or your parental units are supposed to be for your family, where they're supposed to keep you safe, and they failed. And I thought about that with this statement, and I never really saw it as a kid, but as an adult, it like really hit me hard last night.
Yeah. It's like, it's kind of a double whammy too, because you're imagining what that failure must be like for the people who were counting on him for protection.
Yeah.
And then you're also seeing his own, like the ramifications of him dealing with his own failure. It's just the saddest goddamn thing. Like, he's just
it
like,
really is.
Like, yeah, he's this father figure. And it's like, what happens where like and again, it's introducing these concepts that are so deep for kids. Like we're talking about, the death of your parents, but we're also talking about like the fallibility of your parents. Like your parents aren't perfect and they are going to fail you in certain ways. And how do you deal with that? And that kind of realization is jarring, not just for the people who have been failed, but for the person who has failed them.
Yeah.
So it's bringing up some really heavy stuff.
Right now, I'm just thinking about as a kid, the way your parents. Oh my God. Woo. Okay.
Are we going to actually get Mary Beth to like openly sob on this episode? That's.
It's getting closer and closer.
Close.
So, like, if you want me to start talking about my familial problems, just kidding. No one wants that. But it is just like, you think about it as when you're a kid and when you rely on adults to protect you, even when like you're a teenager, and the ways that they can't protect you and how you feel betrayed by that. But at the same time, they're not infallible human beings who can't. Oh, okay. I can't.
Yeah.
I'm 37 years old and I'm still navigating how to handle that. And I say that as someone who, for the most part, like, I got real lucky in my parents. They're and they the fatal fuck ups that they've made are the ones that like I think most parents have made. But it's also like it's how do you try to articulate this? Like, how do you navigate acknowledging and taking seriously the ways in which they failed you while also accepting them for what they still are?
Yeah.
Oh God.
It's not easy. It's always something that I'm like maybe figuring out in my late 30s, but you still get tripped up.
So I really like the ending of this movie from a like meta textual standpoint where, the childlike princess is telling Atreyu, that he being Bastian has suffered with you. He went through everything that you went through. And that it kind of ties back into that, the kind of magicalness of reading and experiencing other people's stories through reading, because it's like, these characters went through a lot of trauma, but so did you by reading through it and you survived it. Mm-hmm. And it brings back to that moment where Urgel says it has to hurt if it's to heal.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
A hard time. There are tears coming down my face, and I have never cried during an episode. And this movie that I said I didn't know if I liked, I'm like openly crying.
But I also think about so there's that, and I think that is an important aspect of the story, because Bastian has to hurt, Atreyu has to go through that in order to come out on the other side a changed person. And that is the progress of rebirth. That's the progress of, being that the idea of the caterpillar turning into a butterfly. It's that kind of metaphor that, you have to go through pain if that wound is ever going to heal. But then there's also the side of creation and the creation of stories. And that was the other part of this ending, kind of taking it out of the sad thing into a happy thing, where it's like the very end.
I'll ruin that for you too, by the way, but go on.
By the end of the story, so all of Fantasia is gone, except for a single grain that she's holding in her hands, and it's dark. And she says the story, in the beginning, it always is dark. And it's that idea of, you could take that in religious ways of like, let God say let there be light. But the way I was looking at it more so was this idea of shared stories and telling stories, where there's a kernel, there's like this little spark of an idea, and you might not know what it is, but it's right there. And then by giving that on to someone and sharing the art of storytelling, you end up continuing the story in different ways, and it ends up being that never-ending story because we're all telling a story together. And that's what really got me at the end of this movie.
Yeah, like
I gotta go. I have to leave.
All right, so like I might as well, like, we're already kind of like bummed out. I might as well kind of take it home here. But to give you an idea on like how weirdly I interpreted things as a kid, one of the things about the ending of this movie that always kind of gnawed on me is that, it's this idea of like, your imagination can bring Fantasia back. Mm-hmm. And, he basically kind of recreates Fantasia with his own imagination. there was always that part of that voice in the back of my head that was saying like, okay, but is this like for real Fantasia, or is this just what Bastian is able to kind of like duplicate with his own mind? It's kind of going to that idea of like, they talk about like, if you replace every part of a car with a new part, is it that same car anymore?
Oh God.
and so like, it's one of those things where like, I'm looking back, I'm like, damn, 6-year-old Bryan, like, are you okay? Like, why is your mind going here? Cause I'm like, and I think part of it is the way they filmed it. There's a little bit of an emptiness to it, or like a shallowness to, he's recreated it, but he's just seeing it at like the 10,000 foot view from on top of Falkor. And like, he's waving at these characters, but like, it's almost like that's as good as he could get the recreation. Like he almost like, he never has a one-on-one with Atreyu. Like, this is a person he has been on this adventure with the entire time, and they never actually meet face to face. He like waves up at him from like, 500 feet in the air or whatever. Is that just like Bastian's like best attempt at a carbon copy of Atreyu? And it's just like, that's something that like has evolved over the years, where that's still something I think I don't want to say navigate with it, but it's something that's more interesting than like bumming me out as an adult, because it's another one of those things that like, I do really like stories about like, what is reality and what is identity. I think about that, like that car problem, like, is it the same car? Is it not? And what does that mean for us? Because like most of our cells are like, what makes up our body parts aren't the same parts that they were when we were kids. So is it just kind of like what's in our mind? And if that's the case, like, to what degree are we manifesting reality just with our mind? So it's turned into something that's not as freaky as it is interesting, but I think there's also a little bit of like, I'm probably freaked out, as an adult. So all that to say, like, I had a real weird take on the ending of this movie as a kid.
I mean, I get that. That is a lot of existential dread to have as a kid. I was thinking, I don't remember this ending as a kid. This rewatching this time, I remember her holding out her hands and like holding that grain of sand. But like, I don't remember this ending at all, except for when Falkor rushes down and scares the bullies, which I loved as a kid. I love the idea of keeping the story going. And so that is how I'm going to take this ending, not as sort of like a depressing little ending. But for me, it's more of about like, okay, you've seen this movie, you've read this, the story might be over, but now it's time for you to go and create your own stories. Mm-hmm. That's how I'm going to view it, because that other thing makes me sad.
100%. Please look at it that way, because I don't recommend looking at it the way I looked at it.
Wow. Are you okay, Mary Beth?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Want to give this a rating out of 5?
Yeah. Who knew that this kids movie would be the one that reduces your co-host to tears a little bit?
Look, I have a lot of trauma. Okay, on that note.
Let's give it a depressing score out of 5.
Yeah, so let's give it a depressing rating out of 5. Terry, how many drowning horses? Jesus Christ.
Wow.
Okay, I don't think this is a perfect movie. I think that, I don't know how you would have made, I went to look at, gosh, I don't even know where to start with this. I went to go look at the Wikipedia summary of the book, and I was like, wow, there is a lot going on in that book. And I don't know how they would turn that into a movie. And so I think this is an imperfect adaptation in a way, but I also think that there's a lot in here that either we don't really think about, or that is maybe not connected enough that we're going to really see unless we are actively looking at it. So I don't think it is 100% successful with what it wants to do. However, this idea of trying to instill in kids that sort of creativity, and yes, you can have your head in the clouds. Yes, you can be creative. Yes, you can go out there and not have to worry about math and science and stuff. You can draw unicorns if that's what makes you want to, if that is what helps you get through sadness. go out there, create, make something. I think that is a great message for kids. And I really like this movie. I hadn't seen it in maybe 30 years or so. I don't know when I last saw it, but it was probably in the 80s. So I have nostalgia for this movie, but I also think I honestly think it's a damn good movie. And I love its recreation of what it feels like to actually be a kid pulling up a book and feeling so invested in the characters that you don't want to put it down because you need their story to end and see it to its conclusion. So for that, I'm going to give it 4 poor drowning Atraxes out of 5 for me. What about you, Mary Beth?
Well, I'm reassessing my evaluation now because now I fucking cried on the podcast.
Join the club.
Great. So I was going to initially give it 3, but now I'm going to give it 3.5. Sorry, Atrax. I think that this is a beautifully done movie. I think it's really fucking weird, but in a good way. I think some of it doesn't really land for me. I think the ending with the childlike empress is a little bit cheesy and exposition dumpy. But regardless of that, I think this is a really beautiful movie about fantasy, but also about books and what books mean to kids, especially lonely kids who need an escape. And so I'm going to give it 3.5.
There you go.
So Bryan, you have the final word. How many drowning horses out of 5 do you give the NeverEnding Story?
I almost don't want to give it a good grade because I don't know if I want to drown multiple horses.
We should have done a reverse scale. 0 means you love it and Atrax actually lives.
But since we're leaning into this, I'm drowning 4.5 horses.
There you go.
Okay.
The seams showed a little bit more for me this last viewing.
Mm-hmm.
It's also one of those movies that I think I also love because of its flaws. It's a messy movie. It's a weird movie, but it's also a very bittersweet and beautiful movie. The fact that it was able to take me back to the feelings that I had when I was 6 or 7 years old, there's not a lot that can still do that. So for that alone, I have to give it a good score. So yeah, I'm going to go 4.5.
You also just cut that horse in half. That's
well, we can maybe put our halves together.
Yeah, he'll be fine, and then we'll drown that whole horse.
Poor Atrax. Take us home, Mary Beth.
What?
Oh, that's me.
No, that's you.
God damn it.
I was like, no, not.
Wow. In my mind, I had already said all of this stuff. I was just I was waiting for you. So you've heard from us, but we want to hear from you.
Nope.
Okay.
You scared me. I was like, uh-oh, did I fuck up?
Oh, jeez. Nope, it's just me. Lost in the clouds. Need to get my feet on the ground and continue forward. So anyway, thank you so much for Bryan for traumatizing us and making us cry while we talk about the NeverEnding Story. Where can our listeners?
I'm not sure if I should be ashamed or proud of that. Maybe a little bit of both.
I think it's wild that we are I don't know, at this point, by the time this comes out, maybe 80 episodes in, and this is the first time that has happened. So I think you should hold that as a badge of honor that we were talking about the NeverEnding Story and getting us so fucking emotional. So
we can
thank you.
Just give us a chance to feel.
Turn around.
Look at what you see.
It's the NeverEnding Story.
Apparently what we're seeing is a bunch of people weeping.
You see, Mary Beth and Terry on the floor crying about being children.
Hello, darkness, my only friend, right? Isn't that how that goes?
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Old friend, yeah. Anyway, so thank you again, Bryan. Where can our listeners find you? And what do you have that you'd like to plug?
So I'm a little bit everywhere. I kind of like to pop my head up in a few different places. So I've got Daily Dead. I'm on their podcast, Corpse Club. I also do some writing for Morgue. I'm the short horror editor for the website. And I also do a column for the magazine called Shadowland, which is pretty cool. It kind of gets into some of the real life inspirations for kind of some of our favorite different horror and genre movies. And I also do some, I've just started doing some reviews and some different columns for cinepunks.com. So basically, if you want to keep up with all of that, I'm on Twitter way too much. We already talked about my dumbass screen name, which is at Evil Taylor Hicks.
At Evil Paul Hollywood.
Yeah, that'll be my backup.
Yes.
But yeah, pretty much anything, like if you want to follow anything that I have coming out, I'm way too active on there. So odds are you'll probably be able to find it there.
Aren't we all too active on Twitter? So listeners, you've heard from us, but we want to hear from you. What was your experience with the NeverEnding Story, and did it reduce you to tears at an adult age on a podcast? I want to hear that very specific experience. You can send us an email at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us directly on Twitter. I'm at MB McAndrews. What? Stop fucking laughing at me.
I'm not laughing at you. I just think it's like, you get that emotional break, and then everything is like giggles
That's
afterwards.
true.
And I'm at that part. I apologize.
No, I understand.
Glad you feel better, Terry.
Jesus. Oh, man. I'm at Gaily Dreadful.
All right. And of course, make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter at Scarred Podcast.
And please don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe. I think our tears earned at least
Blood, sweat, and tears,
today.
Motherfuckers. Blood, sweat, and
There you
tears. Thank you to Eric Power for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you to everyone for listening and witnessing a mental breakdown over a podcast. Stay safe out there. Try to stay sane. And also stay creepy.
And until next time.
Won't somebody please think of the children? Somebody please think of the children. Somebody please think of the children.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
What is the briefing room?
It's a behind-the-scenes look at how the criminal justice system works and the lives of the people within that system.
If you love true crime, well, these are the real people who do the job every day of making sure justice is served.
Hi, I'm Detective Dave.
I'm Detective Dan. Together, we have decades of experience in local law enforcement, a profession that we think is often misunderstood.
So we're going to explore how to do it right, and we won't shy away from when it's done wrong. These are stories you'll hear nowhere else. Unique, frank, and unvarnished.
From the team that brought you Small Town Dicks, this is The Briefing Room. Episode 1 drops on August 30th. We'll meet you in the briefing room.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.